Welcome to Buried Secrets, a podcast about the paranormal, the occult, and weird and forgotten history. I'm Chris. Spirit photography has a long and troubled history. When the subject comes up, my first thought is of hoaxers like William H. Mumler and William Hope, whose photographs were debunked in the 19th and 20th centuries respectively. Much of the early belief in spirit photography seemed to rely on people not understanding the new technology of photography. Back then, people didn't know how easy it was to doctor photos and shoot double exposures. See also the endearingly fake Cottingley Fairy photos. But nowadays, we know how easy it is to Photoshop an image, and we understand that photographs can be deceptive. How can you trust a digital photo that you know can be easily modified? Also, in an age when people are heavily filtering images that they post online, and maybe even making cosmetic changes to their own appearance in photographs, we've been trained not to trust pictures. We know that it is trivially easy to fake things in digital photographs. So I think that is one of several reasons why instant photography has become somewhat popular in the paranormal and among paranormal investigators. Last episode, I talked about nostalgia in the paranormal and the ways in which a lot of our paranormal investigation tools are technology from the 1980s and 1990s, and instant photography is no exception here. So, of course, maybe this is my own nostalgia talking, but there's always been a certain appeal to instant photography. It is incredibly immediate and physical. You take the photograph, the camera spits out a packet of glossy paper and chemicals, and in 10 minutes or so, it's been developed into a picture. Polaroid photos are very tangible. They immediately allow you to have a keepsake of a particular moment in time. They provide a physical reminder of where you were, who you were with, or what just occurred. I love bringing my Polaroid or Fujifilm instant camera on trips because it's nice to have that physical souvenir of a place, rather than just a bunch of smartphone photos that are probably going to get lost in your files in the cloud anyway. So before I get into talking about instant photography, in the interest of full disclosure, I do not consider myself a photography expert by any means. I barely count as a competent amateur, but I have been using a Fujifilm Instax Mini 8 camera for about 8 years and a Polaroid Now I-type camera for the last 2 years. So I have a decent amount of experience using two types of instant cameras. Based on what I've seen online, the Fujifilm Instax line seems to be more popular than the more expensive and, in my limited experience at least, more glitchy Polaroid Now line. So that's just good to know, I suppose. Though I've definitely used my Polaroid camera more, despite its glitchiness. Just because I kind of like the glitches, and I think that the images are a little bit more aesthetic. Even in the age of digital photography, and despite their limitations, I'm always amazed by instant photos because, like I said, they're physical products that I get to hold in my hand. They aren't digital detritus like the photos that pile up on our phones. They feel real, and they are real, whether or not the images that they depict are real. When trying to create a record of something as insubstantial as a ghost, of course it makes sense to want to do that through a physical means. Because, again, instant photographs allow you to take a particular moment in time, something that can only be experienced by being there physically, and turn it into an artifact immediately. I think there's something in the desire to try to capture a non-corporeal entity like a ghost in an incredibly physical and immediate form of media. It almost feels like a way to prove the existence of a ghost. Like it's a more tangible form of proof if it is a physical photo that was actually there in the room with the ghost, you know? We're not talking about 35mm film that needed to be developed in a lab. We're talking about images that maybe caught something anomalous and really had contact with whatever may have been present at that time. In addition to being harder to fake than digital photography, a Polaroid of a ghost or paranormal phenomena translates an insubstantial thing into a very real feeling photograph. It literally takes the image of a ghost, assuming you've captured a photo of a ghost on a Polaroid photo. It takes it from the theoretical, invisible, untouchable realm of the unknown and turns it into a physical photograph that you can hold. The desire to want to catalog your paranormal experiences using Polaroids makes complete sense to me. If you see a potentially paranormal anomaly in your instant photo, it feels like the phenomena is more real because it was captured in that picture. So it makes complete sense to me that instant photography has become increasingly popular among people who are trying to photograph ghosts and the anomalous. After all, where's the room for fakery when an image is immediately output in a physical form? Well, it turns out there are multiple ways to manipulate instant photos, and there are plenty of reasons to be skeptical of them as paranormal evidence, which I'll go into in a sec. But before I get there, I guess it's worth saying that there are people who I respect who have a lot of faith in instant photography, and I'm not ready to dismiss it as a potential way to capture evidence of the paranormal. I'm always ready to be convinced that I'm wrong in my skepticism of the medium, though to be fair, I am somewhat skeptical of any kind of spirit photography with both film and digital cameras, but I also believe that it's totally possible. It's just not very probable, and it's easy to fake anomalies in film or digital photos. So my first thought is always that an image probably isn't real, but I'm always willing to be convinced otherwise. I'm not really interested in debunking or casting serious doubt on the use of instant photography in paranormal investigation, though I think it's helpful to know any tool's limitations. However, if instant photography is vulnerable to manipulation, and that fact is well known enough that it is accessible via a simple online search, then why would such an unreliable medium be so trusted in ghost hunting? Is it kind of the emotional factor that I've talked about? Is it nostalgia? I've seen so many aesthetic images of ghost hunting kits that include Polaroid cameras, and even knowing what I know now about Polaroid manipulations, I understand the impulse to trust an instant photo over a digital one. It just feels more real. If you think about it, it's incredible that photography is so accessible nowadays through digital photography. That being said, the fact that we carry around smartphones that are capable of taking great pictures can make those images, as awesome as they look, feel cheap, ordinary, and somewhat unreal. I know most people nowadays pay for a cloud service that backs up their photos as they take them, but if you're like me and you don't do that, it's always possible that you could just lose all of your recent shots if you lose your phone. Or you could be like me, where, knock on wood, I have not lost a phone, but I have had external hard drives fail. And in one instance, I lost several years' worth of photographs, and there's something chilling and alienating about a part of the visual history of your life being wiped out. Those lost photographs, most of the pictures that I was in and that I took from 2012 to 2013 until about 2017, still upset and haunt me. I think frequently about those pictures that I know existed at one point and have just vanished in a hard drive failure. And I don't have a Facebook account, and my only social media is for the podcast, so I didn't even have any kind of social media fallback to get those pictures back. So I think for me in particular, I have a ambivalence toward digital photos, because in the back of my head, I always feel like they could all disappear in an instant. And I don't think I'm the only one who feels that way. But whether or not you've ever lost your phone or had a hard drive crash, there is something ghostly and untrustworthy about digital pictures. At their core, they are insubstantial, simple to modify, and easily lost. All that being said, like I mentioned earlier, instant photographs can be more easily manipulated than you might think. I even found a 2008 forum thread, which I will link in the show notes, where commenters offered possible debunkings of a famous batch of ghostly Polaroids. While I was doing the research for this, I found a list of 15 reasons why Polaroids are making a comeback, and I was surprised to find that reason number 7 was that Polaroid photos are, quote, easy to manipulate. And the reason why that surprised me was because when I started doing the research for all of this, I didn't realize that was a thing that you could do. But according to the article, which was published on thephotographyprofessor.com and which is linked in the show notes, quote, if you are still interested in doing some post-production type editing on your photos, you are in luck. There are all kinds of techniques you can use to manipulate your pictures, and some of them can be really unique. This is just one more benefit of using Polaroids for artsier photos. One of the techniques you can use to customize your photos is pushing around the chemicals underneath the photo paper before they have fully developed. When the image appears on the paper, the fixer is still working, so the chemicals can be moved around with a cotton swab or pencil. This can create some incredibly unique effects. Another technique you can use is exposing the photo to more light before the fixer has finished working. By shining a flashlight or other light source onto the image, you will double expose the film and create elements that would not have otherwise been in the picture. There's even a Wikipedia page detailing ways to manipulate Polaroids, which I will also put in the show notes. However, the article does note that newer Polaroid film is more difficult to manipulate than the older film types, which are no longer being manufactured. But here's what Wikipedia says about how to modify Polaroids. As the picture develops, modifications can be performed by applying pressure on the surface of the film, using tools that do not scratch the outer plastic layer. Alternatively, a pattern can be superimposed on the image by laying the film face down on a textured surface and applying pressure. I also found an interview with a photographer on uniquephoto.com that went into more details about ways to manipulate Polaroids. In addition to the techniques that I already talked about, this article also mentions that you can heat or cool the print as it develops in order to affect the final result, and it suggests using a dried up ballpoint pen to push around the emulsion under the film. So after reading all of this and after writing a couple blog posts about it, I asked myself whether it was possible to manipulate Polaroids using the new film and the new cameras. Like I said, I own a modern Polaroid camera from 2021, so I decided to do some experiments. I didn't spend an enormous amount of time or money doing this because I guess it's worth mentioning Polaroid photos cost, I want to say around $1.75 per exposure, though I usually buy my film on eBay, so it's cheaper than that. So, I used less than one roll of film to do this because they're quite expensive. But I followed the instructions in the articles that I just read from, and here are the techniques I attempted. I folded and massaged the pictures while they were developing. I shined lights onto certain parts of an image, so I punched holes on a black piece of paper, I put that over a developing Polaroid photo, and then I shined a bright lamp over it so the light hit just those punched out bits of the photo. And then I used an eraser, like on a pencil, to apply pressure to different parts of the image. So did that work? The answer is no, not really. My first experiment just tore one of the layers within the photo, leaving a slightly ragged looking hole in the image underneath the plastic film, but it was barely noticeable. I saw no results from shining light on specific parts of the image while it developed, and I can barely see the lines that I drew on one of the photos using the eraser, and I'm not sure whether I'm just seeing residue from the eraser or a change in the emulsion underneath. So does that mean that modern Polaroid film can't be doctored to fake paranormal results either accidentally or intentionally? Again, no. If you wanted to, you could still get some pretty weird anomalous stuff on your Polaroids, either because of a camera glitch or because you intentionally tried to make something weird happen. So, like I mentioned, my camera is consistently inconsistent in how it renders images. Many photographs that I have taken under ideal conditions still contain weird artifacts in various parts of the frame. It's not something that I'm doing intentionally, and I've tried to clean the rollers, I've done all the stuff that's supposed to fix it, and it's not gotten any better over time, but I do end up with some pretty interesting looking, weird photos that look weird for technical, completely mundane reasons, and I'm sure I'm not the only one who has this happen. So that's weird glitches under ideal conditions. But if you're taking pictures under non-ideal conditions, even more weird stuff happens. So one thing that I think a lot of people don't know about instant film, if they don't take a lot of instant photos, is that they're sort of delicate. You do not want to expose your instant photos to sunlight. If you do that while they're developing, they can end up looking blown out and overexposed. And I know I said my experiment with the lamp didn't do anything, but I have definitely screwed up photos before I realized you have to basically like take a photo, and then I usually just put it back in the cardboard box that the film came in. And you just have to like let it sit in there for 10 to 15 minutes before bringing it out so you can look at it. Otherwise, the light could ruin the photo. And also, I know you're supposed to lie the photo flat rather than shaking it or holding it vertically. I'm not as strict about that. Like, I obviously don't shake the photos, but I just stick them in the box and put it in my backpack and they're usually fine. Or if it's winter, I put them in the inside pocket of my coat to keep them warm. Because that's the other thing. If you're taking pictures in temperatures of less than 55 degrees Fahrenheit, the images will start to look blue and, in my experience, a bit streaky. I've had them look overexposed and weird. And in the heat, photos can develop a sort of orange or yellow or red cast. And then there's other non-ideal conditions that can do weird stuff to your photos. So if you, hypothetically drop your camera in just such a way that the film cartridge falls out, you can get all sorts of weird effects. All right, that's not a hypothetical. That happened to me while I was taking pictures in Boston when I was transferring trains last year, and I walked across Boston from one train station to another and took pictures. And I got some really interesting photos after dropping my camera that looked almost like ghostly figures. And it was just because I dropped my camera. It was consistent through multiple photos in the cartridge. Like, it was clear that the light or something had just been exposed in a particular pattern across a bunch of the photos. But if you were not super scrupulous, you could maybe try to pass that off as something anomalous. And then it's really important to remember also that some cameras, like my Polaroid camera, offer double exposure options. So you could really easily mimic the original 19th century double exposure hoaxed spirit photograph as well. And I think people nowadays are very savvy about how photography works and they understand double exposures of people. So I don't think you could do the exact 19th century double exposure spirit photography grift, but you could definitely do an interesting double exposure that has something weird and anomalous and pass that off as something. So that's always important to keep in mind as well. Even the new, harder to manipulate film still has all sorts of ways to make them look weird. And I'm sure that someone who knows more about photography than I do can list even more ways to get some weird, anomalous stuff on your instant photo exposure. All right, so that's some of the technical side of instant photography, both reasons why instant photography might be more trusted for spirit photography and paranormal investigations, and also reasons why we should maybe be skeptical. But I also mentioned nostalgia as a reason for why instant photography is popular in the paranormal right now. So as someone who was born in the 1980s, instant photography holds a special place in my heart. Polaroid branded instant cameras in particular, because that's just what I remember from my childhood. In the course of doing this research, I realized that there are some compelling and interesting reasons why people might feel so nostalgic about Polaroids aside from, I remember them from my childhood. So I wanted to pause and explore them here. Let's talk about the history of Polaroids. The Polaroid Corporation was founded in 1939, and they rolled out the very first instant camera, the land camera, in 1948. So, less than a century ago. Polaroid enjoyed decades on top of the instant photography world. Though it faced a slow decline starting in the late 1970s and into the 1980s, The company reached its peak revenue in 1991. Over the following decade, things got gloomier for the company, which finally declared bankruptcy in 2001. The company slowly trundled along after that before finally stopping production of their instant film in 2008. While I was reading about their corporate history, I realized that the dates in their story feel really significant. They read like a list of watershed dates from the last 85 years. They released the first instant camera during that initial blush of post-war American prosperity. Polaroid was a 20th century icon that declined as the world shifted between the 1970s and the 1990s. The company finally face-planted in the year 2001, a year that marked a major turning point societally, shifting from the optimism of the new millennium to the chaos and ennui following 9/11. And then Polaroid shut things down in 2008, the year that the Great Recession began making major headlines. I'm sure that someone could do a fascinating, detailed analysis charting the rise and fall of Polaroid and what that says about society, but to me, I see two things: uncertainty and change. Nostalgia, as I talked about last time, erupts during times of change, and many people, myself included, self-soothe with nostalgia. Because the timeline of the original Polaroid Corporation hits the big beats of change during the late 20th century into the 2000s, it strikes me as a particularly nostalgic brand. Also, for people my age, of course, instant photography is something that we remember from our childhood, and for a while, it sort of represented something lost. For a long time, before the brand was resurrected, Polaroids were bygone tech from a bygone era. I always think about this one time in college when I moved into a new dorm for the summer, and this would have been in the late 2000s, right after Polaroid shut everything down, and you really couldn't get Polaroid products, really. I remember I moved into a new dorm, and while I was moving a piece of furniture in there, I found a Polaroid photo that had the month and day written on it, but not the year. And based on how that dorm was maintained, that photo could have been 10 or 20 years old, or it could have been 1 year old. It really wasn't like cleaned super well between inhabitants. So I remember getting this photo and being so charmed by it because in 2009 or whenever this was, you couldn't just take Polaroid photos unless you had a vintage camera. And it always felt like such an enchanted thing to have this timeless photo. I didn't know when it was from. It was just a picture out the window of that dorm room, but there was nothing in the picture that had changed in the last 20 or 30 years. You know, it was a picture of like some old buildings on campus. And it felt to me like just this little window into time. And that was 14 years or so ago, and I still have the picture hanging on my fridge in my current apartment, just because it always felt like such an enchanted object. And I didn't know who took it, I didn't know when they took it, and it kind of invited imagination and storytelling to me. And I think so much of that sense of a sort of like romantic or whimsical aspect to Polaroids, for me at the time, was because that tech was no longer accessible. They had stopped making it. And I don't think I'm the only person who felt that way. Before I move on, I do want to dwell a little bit more on the corporate history of Polaroid and just kind of the significance of those dates that I mentioned earlier. So because we're talking about nostalgia and because I am who I am, I'm just going to look at some of those dates from my lifetime. So for me, it's easy to look at 1991, Polaroid's financial peak, and say, wow, things were so different in the early 90s. The world feels so much more complex now, especially if you, like me, were a child at the time. Though I think because of the whole weird end of history discourse that was happening in the 1990s, it's very likely that people older than me also feel that way about the 90s, I think. So that's 1991. You could look at 2001, when the company declared bankruptcy, and you can think about the dot-com bubble and how the late 1990s And the early 2000s was a time of unparalleled, if foolish, perhaps, optimism about technology. You know, it's really easy to look back at 2001, especially the first 9 months or so, maybe 8 months or so of that year, and think, wow, we had no idea what was coming. We were blissfully unaware. Even though in both 1991 and 2001, I think we were at a bit of a precipice and everything was about to change in unimaginable ways. Each of those years were followed by a decade of huge change. Or you could look at 2008, which was defined by the existential horror of the Great Recession, though there was also an undercurrent of hope that many people felt at the time of Obama's election. So I would say that 2008, especially early 2008, before the big crash in September, was the last glimmer of optimism, which was about to be snuffed out. And, you know, that's when Polaroid closed production. And that's also kind of when, I don't want to be dramatic and be like, when my generation's dreams died. But for people my age, that was a time that we saw that our lives were going to be very different from our parents. And for people like me who were in college at the time, we very quickly learned that, you know, everything about our economic life was going to be different from how we thought it was. So a big turning point for a lot of us, I think. When I think of Polaroids, I'm brought back to that idyllic time before our hopes as a society were dashed. And maybe you feel the same way, or if you're younger than me, maybe you have a vaguer sense of the vibes during the 90s and 2000s, but you still recognize that faint sheen of optimism that coats the technology of that time. I think I mentioned this last time, but I spend a lot of time watching YouTube videos of people restoring, like, retro tech from the 90s and the 2000s, and that stuff has millions of views. I know a ton of people love to watch those videos. And when I look at things like the iMac and like those clamshell MacBooks and all of the stuff from that period, there was this sense of fun and novelty. And even though Polaroids were a thing from the early 20th century, it feels like it's of a piece with a lot of that tech that people were kind of just having fun with, or at least that was the narrative, like that you could have fun with this technology. So, like I mentioned, Polaroid Corporation doesn't exist anymore, though to be clear, I'm not one to mourn the demise of large corporate powers. Nowadays, the brand has been revived by a company called the Impossible Project, which was founded in 2008 to produce Polaroid film after Polaroid stopped making it. Impossible now does business as Polaroid BV, but it's more commonly called just Polaroid. Though it, of course, is not the same company that used to make Polaroid cameras. That one is gone forever. This is just a new company with the IP. So let's get back to Polaroids and ghost hunting. So I talked about some of the ways that Polaroids can be doctored, and in theory, I'm not convinced that there is a valid technical reason to trust instant photos over digital ones. It seems like if a ghost can be captured by an analog camera, it can be captured by a digital one. At least that's what I thought when I initially started doing this research. You know, the only justification I could think of was just a general tendency to trust analog devices more when it comes to ghost hunting, and that's what I've been trying to suss out now. Is there a real reason to believe that analog devices are better for paranormal investigation, or is something else, nostalgia, alienation, mistrust of tech, motivating the tendency to trust retro devices over contemporary ones? You know, it's something I'm thinking about throughout this whole series on nostalgia, but this next part that I'm going to get into kind of blew my mind and made me revise my stance on digital photography as a way to collect paranormal evidence. And now I would say that I am inclined to trust digital photos on older digital cameras. I don't really have a date for what I consider older or newer because I don't know enough about digital camera technology. But I feel that it's safe to say that the rise of computational photography completely throws a wrench into everything when it comes to being able to trust digital photographs, period, but especially with paranormal investigation. Earlier, I was talking about, what are some ways that you could intentionally fake photos, whether you're photoshopping something or on an instant photo, kind of doctoring the photo, doing a double exposure, whatever. But here's a question. What if your device doctored the photo for you without you even realizing it? While doing all this research, I came across a number of articles talking about how digital photography, especially smartphone photography, is beginning to feel less and less reliable when it comes to, let's say, representing reality. It turns out that in some circumstances, you can't trust the pictures that you take on your phone, not for some vague reason or some Luddite reason, but because of computational photography. And also just the fact that there's a lot of stuff that goes on under the hood of digital image making in general that we just might not be aware of. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is Samsung's photo enhancements on their phones. I'll get into way more detail on that. But before I do that, the other thing that kind of happened around the time that I was doing all this research that really kind of made me stumble when it came to trusting images on a computer. So that other thing was the acropolis bug, which is so hard for me to say. But basically, it was an issue that people encountered where they were cropping out or redacting sensitive information on screen grabs on their Google Pixel phones, and they learned that the redacted data was still available in the file and could be retrieved. So for example, say you're posting something online and the image includes a payment screen, so you just go into your photo app and either crop the photo so your credit card info is out of it, or you go in with the little pen tool and redact it. And, people did that with credit card numbers, with names, addresses, and all sorts of sensitive information. But someone discovered that actually, under certain circumstances, that data was being stored with the, quote, redacted image. And if you plugged it in to something that allowed you to retrieve that data, you could get the unredacted image. So basically, you crop an image, you redact it, whatever, you look at it on your screen and you're like, okay, I did my due diligence. I can see that I've cropped this out. It's now safe to share. And the truth is that what you see on your screen is not the reality, right? Like that data is still there in the file, even if you can't see it. And by the way, a second acropolis bug was also found on Windows devices with their screen grab software, I believe. So that's just another strike against feeling like you can trust the images on your devices. It's not related to photography, but it is related to whether digital images reflect reality, right? And, it's a good reminder to all of us that if you have a screen grab with sensitive information that you have redacted, just take a second screen grab of the redacted thing to be extra safe. Even though they've fixed these bugs, I believe, you can't be too safe, right? That's a good best practice for all of us. So anyway, let's get to the more interesting part of this and talk about fakery in smartphone photography and how computational photography has really, I don't want to say gotten out of hand, but it's kind of gotten out of hand. So I've used this term computational photography a couple times. What is that? Wikipedia describes it as image capture and processing techniques that use digital computation rather than optical methods. That's a pretty nothing burger sort of definition, but basically, it turns out that computational photography can modify the images that we photograph with smartphone cameras in various ways. An article in The Verge sums up the recent controversy that happened with Samsung's computational photography really well, so I just want to read a paragraph from that. This is from an article that was published in March of this year, right when I was doing this initial research. This week, Samsung drew criticism for the technology its newer phones use to enhance photos of the moon. A user on Reddit, iBreakPhotos, conducted an experiment by creating a blurred photo of the moon and then taking a picture of it using their Galaxy S23 Ultra. Even though the photo was completely blurry, their Samsung device appeared to add details to the image that weren't there before, like craters and other marks, calling into question whether the highly detailed moon photos people have been taking with their Galaxy devices really are photos of the moon. The Verge article is a fascinating read. I linked to it in the show notes. Not only does it document the Samsung moon augmentation scandal, but it also talks about how many images of the moon that we see have been modified, even before all of this. Part of that's just because it's so easy to do these days. So, to read a bit more from the article, while faking the night sky once involved sandwiching negatives, doing things in the dark room, it's become far easier and more prevalent in the age of Photoshop. One of the biggest things people do is sky replacements. Lindsay Schroeder, a professional astrophotographer, tells The Verge, they'll take the Milky Way from a different photo and Photoshop it in so that it looks like it was there. An expert would immediately know that it's fake, but to the general public, they don't know. As someone who's reworked plenty of photos in Photoshop, I can say this sort of thing. That sort of photo manipulation is, in many cases, trivially easy, but I'd also say that it's not totally unexpected. And as popular apps like Facetune allow people to easily modify photos on their mobile devices, folks have just learned to trust digital photography less and less. However, Samsung's wholesale replacement of the moon in photos using a, quote, deep learning-based AI detail enhancement engine strikes me as a step beyond that. Samsung has apparently been using AI in their cameras since the Galaxy S20, and their scene optimizer technology has been in the phones since the Galaxy S21 series. Though I can tell you that my pictures of the moon that I've taken on my Galaxy S22 Plus still look like garbage. So either they've made some major changes on their later devices, or I guess I gotta try using my photos 100x zoom, which I had no idea existed before this research and keep forgetting to check out. Maybe then that would give me an AI moon, which I guess, I don't really want anyway. But it kind of concerns me that this AI photography has been on our devices kind of just quietly for years, because it's one thing for someone to decide to modify their own photographs. It's another for apps themselves to rework images in the process of capturing them without the user's consent or knowledge. For me, this spirals out into philosophical and existential issues immediately. So in the case of someone photographing the moon and getting a completely different image than the one they were taking a picture of, there was never a real unedited version of the image. You can't revert between the edited and original versions. The edit is the only one that exists. It's not like taking a picture and then bringing it into Photoshop and making some changes. There's only the fake, and you might not even know that it's fake. Now, Samsung isn't the only company that has introduced computational photography into its cameras, so, iPhone users have had this for quite some time as well. Not the weird moon thing, but computational photography, like Apple's live photos and their portrait mode. Apple Insider had an interesting article about this, which I link in the show notes, but they say, quote, users are beginning to ask where to draw the line between these algorithms and something more intrusive, like post-capture pixel alteration. Like I said, this raises so many questions, but the problem of memory resonates the most to me. Many people, myself included, use smartphone photos as an aide-memoire, right? I'll often take pictures not because something is beautiful or because I'm expressing myself artistically, but because I want to remember something. More likely than not, I'm not going to post that image to Instagram. Let's be honest, I only really post selfies on Instagram to stories when I'm pissed off. So if I take a picture, I'm not going to post it to Instagram probably, but I will scroll back in my phone, see the time-stamped, unaesthetic mirror selfie in a venue bathroom and think, oh right, that's the day I went to that concert. And just seeing that image and being reminded of where I was, what day that was, what I was wearing, etc., helps me remember other details from that day. For me, The visual information that I collect in the form of photos is for constructing and preserving my memories more than anything else. So my question is, if our everyday smartphone photos help us remember reality and our pasts, what happens when, unbeknownst to us, our cameras are modifying the images? It becomes a form of memory modification. At that point, you aren't the arbiter of your own memories. The images on your phone can override your own recollections, especially if you're someone like me and you rely on photos to help you remember things from your past. As Apple Insider eloquently puts it, the final image doesn't represent what the sensor detected and the algorithm processed. It represents an idealized version of what might be possible, but isn't, because the camera sensor and lens are too small. There's something truly chilling about that to me, because here we are in a place where large tech corporations have the power to override reality and perhaps even our very memories. So no wonder instant photography, despite its limitations, feels like one of the best ways to access paranormal realities and to document paranormal experiences. They could even be one of the best ways to access our mundane reality and our own everyday memories. But this raises other questions when it comes to paranormal photography. Because if smartphone cameras are increasingly depicting idealized images of the world, smoothing out anomalies and removing deviations from what a computer might consider normal, what does that mean for paranormal photography, where the whole point is capturing the anomaly? Is it possible that phone cameras might be capable of capturing paranormal phenomena, but the AI in the phone's camera maybe wipes that out, replacing it with the expected reality? After all, if you're taking a picture of, I don't know, like a weird light in front of a wall or something, and the AI in the phone detects that there shouldn't be this weird light there, will it just, smooth that out? Replace it with the wall that matches the rest of the wall because it looks just like a stray mark or something? And I've definitely heard of cases where people have encountered the paranormal not using their own senses in the initial encounter, but by reviewing evidence, right? Whether it's listening back to audio to get EVPs or reviewing photos to see what weird things appear in the photos that you may not have seen in real life. Like, it is fairly well accepted that you can capture evidence without realizing it and only discover it when reviewing what you've collected. But if you're shooting on a digital device that has an algorithm to get rid of that sort of thing, then you'll never have a chance to find that, right? Of course, it's always possible that strangeness could seep in anyway through synchronicity and glitches, but I just think it's less likely. Or, maybe computational photography is just reducing the number of chances that the paranormal has to interact with us. And who knows, I listen to a lot of podcasts, I watch a lot of YouTube live streams, and I feel like people are always talking about like weird glitches and their connections and stuff. And I almost wonder if that's like the paranormal trying to come through now that it's been blocked from being captured by so much of our technology. Like, for example, Zoom has algorithms that sort of accommodate and get rid of background noise during calls, which is very appreciated on all the many Zoom calls I've been on. But it's just another example of technology kind of smoothing out reality in order to serve a particular purpose and not distract people from that. And who knows, maybe all these tech glitches that we run into is the phenomena kind of being like, you're trying to get rid of us, but we're still going to creep in when we can, right? I find glitches in general, like tech glitches and the paranormal, really interesting. It's something that I kind of like have an eye out for and I'm trying to collect anecdotes about. So if you have thoughts, feelings, or opinions, please email me about it at buriedticketspodcast@gmail.com, because it's just something I've been thinking about a lot lately with all of this. Like, the more controlled and algorithmic and smoothed out, I feel like I keep saying that, but it's such a good way of expressing it. The more smoothed out that our reality becomes, maybe the more glitches we'll have bubbling up, trying to like even that out. I hope so, at least. That's so much less depressing, to me at least, than the idea that we'll just have these like algorithmically perfect photos and recordings and records of our lives, just because that feels so limiting to me, especially when we're talking about the paranormal. So it's funny. When I originally wrote the blog posts that became this episode, I was ready to debunk instant photography in particular, but also analog photography in general when it came to paranormal photography. And I was ready to say that a preference for analog photography and ghost hunting is nostalgic at best and dishonest at worst. You know, like if you want to fake something, you can. And people might be a little bit more credulous. But now I'm not so sure. Because as computational photography continues to dominate our picture making, will our only hope of capturing anomalies be old school analog photography? Seems possible to me. All right. So that's what I've got for this time. I still have more to say about nostalgia and the paranormal, so you can look forward to that next episode as well. And like I said, I'm really interested in people's thoughts about paranormal nostalgia and retro tech and paranormal investigation. So if you have thoughts, please email me at buriedsecretspodcast@gmail.com. I mentioned the show notes a number of times. Those can be accessed at buriedsecretspodcast.com. I also mentioned that I've been blogging a lot lately, so I've been blogging every weekday for the last couple months, I think since March, and it's been kind of a place where I work out things I am thinking about and kind of like play around with ideas before I do episodes about them, and sort of like collect information for future episodes. So if you're interested in a more behind the scenes look or a sort of like looser, less structured look at kind of just whatever's on my mind that week, you can check out buriedsecretspodcast.com to read my blog posts. You can sign up to get emails with them on weekdays on my website. You can also sign up on Substack. It's buriedsecretspodcast.substack.com, I believe. But also, you know, if you have an RSS reader, you can plug my blog into that and just get the post that way. A lot of different ways to subscribe and consume. Other than that, I am on Mastodon at Buried Secrets Podcast, at weirdo.network. I am also still on Instagram, the place where I post angry selfies in my stories, I guess. My username there is just at Buried Secrets Podcast. If you liked this, please rate and review on whatever podcatcher you're listening to this on. Please tell your friends about the podcast. And thanks so much for listening.